All right, let's get into the green revolution. Agriculture is an example of a positive feedback loop. If you think about it, right, we've got a large population and we've got to produce more food to feed it. Because we have more food, we can support a larger population, which means we need more food to feed that larger population. And right, and just like any positive feedback loop, the problem becomes more and more pronounced over time. Agriculture was born about 10,000 years ago when people began domesticating and raising animals, cultivating the soil. They were even selectively breeding certain plant species, turning them into crops, harvesting them, planting them, harvesting them, right? Agriculture has been considered by some to be kind of a double-edged sword because while it has allowed the human population to grow bigger and older, it has put a considerable strain on the environment as a result. Let's talk about that shift then in the before and the after. Before the Green Revolution, humans lived and worked on small farms. They relied quite a bit, the farms relied quite a bit on human labor to do the jobs. There was not a lot of fossil fuel use. After the Green Revolution, which began a little after World War II, well into the 1950s and beyond, we started to see an increase in the use of synthetic fertilizers, chemical pesticides, diverting water from waterways to irrigate land, and then also the use of mechanized machinery to help do kind of the dirty work for the humans, I suppose, right? So again, the Green Revolution kind of began after World War II in the 1950s and beyond, ushered in new chemical fertilizers that brought in nitrogen and phosphorus into the soil to increase crop yields. The Green Revolution ushered in synthetic herbicides, these weed killers, and synthetic pesticides that are chemicals that are used to kill insects. What else did the Green Revolution bring in? The development and the design of high-yield crops, selectively breeding certain crops to increase the amount that can be harvested from them. Also multiple cropping, right? So it says that when a field is used to grow 2 or more crops throughout the year, the field is being constantly used, something's always growing on it. Think about the soil erosion and the degradation of the soil that way, right? The need then for those synthetic fertilizers. The Green Revolution is the reason why we've got close to 8 billion people here on Earth, right? The Green Revolution has, and the agricultural industry as a result, has been able to feed our growing human population. An example here would be in India, right? We can sustain its population on rice and wheat, sugarcane and potatoes because of the different ideas and methods developed during the Green Revolution. What are some of the advantages of the negatives rather, of the Green Revolution? I'm not going to read every single one of these to you, so you can push pause if you need to, but biodiversity loss, think of the large areas of land that are, maybe clear cut or deforested or made room to be able to plow and work the earth. That loss and degradation of the habitat. It destroys habitats, it destroys animals too, and plants native to the area. What else? So some of the negatives of the Green Revolution: soil erosion, the loss of soil fertility, salinization, waterlogging. We talked a little bit about that, right? The desertification of the soil that can happen when you clear cut an area. You don't have shade anymore, and that water that could be retained in the soil evaporates away. You've got pretty soon just dust, right? Imagine wind coming through and blowing it all away. What's another negative to the Green Revolution? Air pollution, right? Think about any time we use one of these machines here, we are turning on an ignition, we are burning fossil fuels and releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Another negative to the Green Revolution here is not only water depletion. I'm thinking of the Ogallala Aquifer, its use, its unsustainable use to irrigate farmland in the United States. But also, look at this, increased runoff and flooding from land cleared to grow crops. Think about any of that runoff. Anytime we have a synthetic fertilizer or pesticide, that could very well get into our waterways whenever it rains, or if a farm is over-irrigated. Human health is also can be an issue, right? We might have some different chemicals, nitrates, pesticides in our drinking water or on our foods if we don't wash them, and that can get into our systems as well. So these are the 5 practices of the Green Revolution. Mechanization, increasing the amount of machines used, diverting water through irrigation, the use of chemical fertilizers to increase crop yields, monocropping, we'll talk about in a moment, and also pesticides. Let's talk about mechanization first. Mechanization increases the use of the machine. So what does that mean? That means that we're increasing the amount of fossil fuels, and whenever you think fossil fuels here in an AP environmental science class, think increased carbon dioxide emissions, think increased global temperatures. But it's not just the fossil fuels that are the problem, right? Mechanization has also allowed farms to get bigger and bigger and bigger. From 1950 to 2000, the size of a farm, for example, in Iowa, doubled from 70 hectares to 143 hectares. I was doing a little Googling to figure out where the largest farm on earth is. It's in China. It's 22 million acres of land, or about 9 million hectares. To give you a comparison, South Carolina here in the United States is 19 million acres. So it would be an area that is larger than the state of South Carolina. A farm larger than the state of South Carolina. Imagine the size of that. Pretty wild. So developed countries here are like the United States are likely to use machines instead of human labor. What that does, right? Think about it, labor and hiring people for this type of work increases the prices. So if we're using machines, that brings the prices down. It's a little bit more economical. Developed countries, in them about less than 5% of the workforce is engaged in agriculture, but it's a little different story in developing countries. Machines are used a little less often. Labor prices are low to begin with because about 40 to 75% of the workforce is engaged in some sort of agriculture. So that's mechanization. The big takeaways, other than this information here, the big takeaways is increased use of fossil fuels, and we're using up more and more of our land. Think about that, means more biodiversity lost as a result. How about some irrigation? This is the process of watering land to promote plant growth. I'm thinking of, let me show you this. So irrigation helps arid lands to be more productive. And so take a look at this. This is a satellite image of the Imperial Valley in California. It's actually, we talked about this before. This is the Salton Sea right here. If you remember, the Salton Sea was created out of kind of an irrigation mistake. The pipe broke and it filled up this area right here. But all below the Salton Sea, this is all of the farmland that's associated with the Imperial Valley. In fact, all of that runoff from the farmland here actually runs into the Salton Sea. Becomes a huge problem. Think about it, as the Salton Sea starts to evaporate away, it leaves behind all of the chemicals that are put into the farmlands. It's mixed into that dust. Imagine winds whipping up the dust, the sediment, but also those chemicals. It's actually getting into people's lungs and causing some really horrible breathing problems out there in the Imperial Valley. I mean, and think about, look at this. This is not supposed to be land that has water in it traditionally, right? It's actually desert. And because we're irrigating this area, it became pretty productive. It produces quite a bit of fruit and vegetables in the area. So 16% of the world's agricultural lands are irrigated, and of those lands, they produce almost 50% of all of the world's food, thanks to diverting water. What are the concerns about irrigating water? Well, how about waterlogging the soil, right? If we put too much water in the area, that water can waterlog the soil, and which will decrease the amount of oxygen that roots are able to take in. What else? Salinization is a problem. It could happen when an area is waterlogged, absolutely, right? Some of that water can infiltrate all the way down to where some of those salts are in the beat layer of the soil. And as that water evaporates away, it brings the salts back up. But it's also a problem because sometimes the water has salt in it. I'm thinking of the salts and stuff that calcium that we see in our showers, for example, right? Our showers, if you ever look up at the shower head, it's got a bunch of white on it. Imagine that over years, that stuff getting onto the soil, it's going to start to accumulate over time. The Green Revolution brought in fertilizers, right? The growing of plants, just the natural process of growing plants removes organic matter and nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus that plants need in order to survive. And so fertilizers that we add to the soil help to replace those nutrients. Organic fertilizers are probably the best you can find. These are made up of organic matter, really stuff that has once been living, right? I'm thinking of decomposing plant, or the foods that go through animals and turns into manure. The problem with organic fertilizers, the reasons why often they're not used by farmers, is because they're very expensive. It takes a really long time to get the right consistency of that organic matter. It needs time for the materials to kind of decompose. So what do farmers then use? They use a much cheaper alternative to an organic fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers. These things are produced commercially, highly concentrated. They've got the nitrogen, they've got the phosphorus that the plants are going to need, so it increases the amount of food that can be grown on the land. Synthetic fertilizers oftentimes are made by burning natural gas, so you're increasing carbon dioxide emissions there, one. But two, you're also using up a natural resource like natural gas in order to make them. So what are the negatives then, right? Highly energy intensive process to manufacture the synthetic fertilizers. And what's the other problem with any fertilizer? You can always think runoff, right? Runoff, eutrophication, introduction of nitrogen, phosphorus into a waterway, algal blooms, hypoxia, decreased dissolved oxygen can result. How about monocropping? Here's another practice that the Green Revolution brought in. Monocropping is large expanses of a single crop. I was doing some reading in the textbook. It says monocropping oftentimes happens on farmlands that are 1,000 acres or much larger. Imagine a gigantic area, 1,000 acres of just land, no trees, no vegetation on it. The farmer goes in with his machinery, plows the land, exposes the topsoil. As a result, 1,000 acres, wind can whip through. Oh my gosh, you guys, that topsoil can go away pretty readily. In fact, it's estimated that the United States loses about 1 metric ton of topsoil per hectare of land every single year, about 2.5 metric tons of topsoil per acre of land every year. Monocropping, though, is efficient. It increases the amount that farmers can get out of their land, right? The amount of food. The problem with it, though, is that it devastates biodiversity and increases the soil erosion. Again, imagine 1,000 acres of land, freshly plowed, exposed topsoil, wind. Not fun. Hey, monocrops are also susceptible to disease and pests. Imagine 1,000 acres of the same plant, and if a disease or a pest comes through, it's going to eradicate all of it instead of just some of it. Monocropping means that our human diet is narrowed a little bit, right? 90% of our food comes from 15 crops and 10 livestock species. We talked a little bit about those 10 plant crops, corn, wheat, and rice. But we also eat fish, chicken, duck, pigs, rabbit. I don't know if last time I had a rabbit, but anyway, you get the list there. Pesticides. A pest is any organism that damages valuable crops. Weeds are any plants that can outcompete with crops. Pesticides are poisons that target specific pests, organisms, not pets. There's different classes of different pesticides, like insecticides, rodenticides, herbicides, fungicides. A lot of pesticides are applied to in the U.S. every single year. 75% of the pesticides are applied to agricultural land. $32 billion per year is spent on pesticides worldwide. Pesticides can be persistent or non-persistent. If a pesticide is persistent, it means that the chemical does not break down over time and can stay in the environment. DDT is a pesticide that does just that. It doesn't degrade over time. So the opposite of a persistent pesticide is a non-persistent one. Non-persistent ones like Roundup, your parents might use on the weeds out front in your yard. Roundup will break down over a couple weeks rather than stay in the environment for years at a time. Two categories of pesticides. Broad spectrum pesticides, these are going to kill many different species. DDT is an example of a broad spectrum pesticide. It will kill regardless of what it is, right? The problem with that, think about it, right? If we're targeting, or we're not targeting a specific pest, but we're targeting all pests, that includes good species like bees, spiders, ladybugs, are also going to be killed. So the opposite of a broad spectrum pesticide then is a narrow spectrum pesticide, and that's one that only is going to kill and target specific types of pests. All right, this is a documentary, I believe, Circle of Poison here, that talks a little bit about some pesticides like DDT having been banned in the United States. But we're still producing and exporting it, though. I'd like to watch this documentary with you guys at some point. I'm thinking maybe Thursday or Friday, so let's put a pin on this. We'll talk a little bit about biomagnification and bioaccumulation later on in the class, but the idea here is that DDT biomagnifies in the food chain. So think of a food chain, right? Let's say that we've got some algae and we've got some DDT in the area that got into a waterway, and the algae kind of mixes with it. What do fish eat? Well, fish eat the algae. What eats the fish? Maybe an eagle comes in, swoops in. So think about this for a moment. The fish has a little bit of DDT in its body cavity. It doesn't just get rid of it. It actually dissolves into the fish's fat. And so as the eagle then eats multiple fish that have a little bit of DDT, because the eagle ate 50 fish, it has 50 fishes DDT in its body as a result, and it's poisoned too. The problem with eagles and DDT is that the chemical actually thins out the eagle's egg, and so even just by regular incubation, the eagle will sit on its egg that's been weakened because of DDT. What happens? It breaks, and the little eaglet dies as a result. Causes reproductive damage in humans, cancers in bird populations, and the problem that I talked about with the eggs too. What's another problem with a pesticide here is that pests can evolve resistance to certain pesticides, right? So some individuals, not all of them, but maybe one or two in a generation might become genetically immune to it. Just their genes don't allow them to die from the pesticide. So what happens? Well, all of the other ones die because they're not resistant, but that one or two that are resistant, well, they live, they reproduce, they pass on that resistant gene to their offspring, and pretty soon the entire population is completely resistant to the pesticide that's supposed to kill them. That could be a problem for farmers, because that's going to decrease the amount of food that they can get as a result, increases prices. So this idea here is that we get this pesticide treadmill, right? This is an example of a positive feedback loop, actually. So pests attack the crops, pesticide is applied, most pests are killed, a few are resistant, they survive, they breed, reproduce, and produce now pesticide-resistant population. Pesticide is applied again, it has little effect. So what has to happen? And the manufacturers then develop new pesticides that they won't be resistant to, and it just keeps going and going and going, right? This problem. So pesticide treadmill happens when chemists increase the chemical toxicity to compete with resistant pests. Here's a fun factoid for you. Over 556 different insect species are resistant to 300 different pesticides. Doesn't sound like fun. Again, this is an example. Oh, weeds and plant diseases have evolved resistance to pesticides too. So this is an example of a positive feedback loop, right? Let's start here. We develop a new pesticide. We apply it. Most pests die. Some survive. That population that survives reproduces, passes on their gene. We apply the pesticide again with little result. The crop is infested with pests, so we develop a new pesticide. We apply it, and so on, right? Another vicious cycle. So what's a sustainable way then to manage your pests? Well, maybe how about an integrated pest management system, or IPM? This is a series of different techniques, both biological, chemical, and physical, that will prevent pests from ruining your crops. Here's an idea. How about crop rotation? This will prevent pest infestations if we rotate our different crops in different areas of our farm. Another way, intercropping, right? Preventing specialized pests from succeeding. How about the use of pesticide-resistant seed varieties too? Another idea for IPM, the use of natural predators to control the pests. This would be an example of biological control. You can also put fences up to keep the pests out too. That would be an example of a physical control. And the use of pesticides only sparingly. All right, so someone to know, we'll talk about her later, but Rachel Carson, she was the person who brought a lot of awareness to the environmental problems of DDT use, specifically with that eagle example I talked about. She played a pivotal role in raising public awareness about environmental issues at the beginning of the modern environmental movement in the United States, right, when it started to get kind of interesting. There's some different laws associated with agricultural problems, like these guys here, the 3 federal agencies that regulate the use of pesticides, the EPA, the USDA, and the FDA. And then there's a couple different laws here, the FIFRA Act, Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. This is where the EPA can access the health risk of active ingredients in pesticides. And the Food Quality Protection Act seeks to reduce the amount of pesticides that we allow in foods that might affect children. All right, last slide. I know this was a marathon. Let's just real quick. Just take a look at this slide, and I'll stop talking. I think this is in our textbook, but yeah, take a look there. This happened in India. I guess I'm not going to stop talking. A gigantic explosion occurred. I mean, this is an environmental accident that happened in 1984. 20,000 people died. 50,000 people suffered permanent injuries, including blindness, lung disease, neurological disorders, because of an explosion that occurred in an underground storage tank that released a lot of toxic gas used in the manufacturing of pesticides. Pretty awful. So it's not just pesticides aren't just bad for the environment, they can also be involved in manufacturing problems too. I hope you got something out of this video lecture, and let me know if you have any questions.